Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, well, we are really rolling up our sleeves. We're undertaking, I guess you could call it, a theological excavation.
That sounds about right.
We're digging into a subject that is, let's just say, incredibly specific
Yeah.
and dense. It honestly makes most of those complex prophecy charts you see look like, well, kindergarten drawings.
It's definitely deep water we're wading into. Eschatological deep water, for sure. We're focusing exclusively on the endgame sequence laid out in our source material today.
Right. And that means drawing very heavily from the book of Revelation, which, as you know, is already packed with symbolism and complex timelines.
Exactly.
Our listener has basically handed us this task to try and measure the precise relationship, the timing between two absolutely monumental future events in Christian theology, which are...
The marriage supper of the Lamb and the 1,000-year kingdom. You know, what people often call the Millennium.
Okay.
And for anyone who studies eschatology, the final things, you know that where you place one of these events relative to the other, it fundamentally reshapes your whole understanding.
No, so.
Well, your understanding of reward, of resurrection, even of eternal life itself, it all shifts depending on this sequence.
So it really is the ultimate timing question, isn't it? Where do we even begin with something like this?
Well, we have to start right at the source hook, I think. Revelation chapter 19, verses 7 through 9. This is really the core imagery that kicks off the whole debate.
Okay, Revelation 19, what does it show us?
It shows this incredible celebration. You see the bride, she's preparing herself, she's getting ready.
And she's wearing something specific, right?
Yes, shining, clean, white linen. And the sources we're looking at today are really crucial here. They confirm this linen isn't just, fancy clothing.
It represents something.
It represents the righteous acts of the saints, their faithfulness, their deeds. And then right after that description, there's this pronouncement, a blessing.
A blessing on who?
On those who are invited to this wedding supper. Blessed are those who are invited.
Okay, so the atmosphere seems pretty clear. It's glorious, it's celebratory.
Definitely. And it's tied directly to, the culmination of faithfulness.
Right.
But the massive question, the one that has genuinely divided scholars, theologians for centuries, it's all about the chronology.
The order of events.
Precisely. What happens first? What happens last? Our deep dive today really centers on this crucial timing debate. Does this eternal feast, the marriage supper, does it happen before the kingdom?
Or maybe during it.
Right. Does it run concurrently with the kingdom for that whole 1,000-year duration? Or is it maybe just a brief internal event, something that happens within the kingdom, maybe right at the start, to inaugurate the reign?
Wow. Okay, the difference between those three scenarios, it feels staggering. It really alters whether you see the millennium as mainly, I don't know, a time of ruling and administration.
Or if it's basically a continuous 1,000-year-long wedding reception, the implications are huge.
Okay, all right. Let's try and unpack this. We need to map out the terrain first, I think. So the sources we're examining, they lay out three main competing theological perspectives, and these are specifically about the timing and the relationship between the marriage supper and the 1,000-year kingdom.
That's right. And it's really important for you, the listener, to try and grasp these distinctions up front, because pretty much every subsequent argument we'll discuss, it rests on which of these views you're trying to, well, either sustain or dismantle.
Okay, so what's the core tension between them? The fundamental tension really boils down to this. Is the marriage event a single concluding ritual? Like a wedding ceremony followed by an immediate reception, a distinct event.
A distinct event that marks a transition. Or is it a prolonged state, a state of maybe administrative union that actually defines the next 1,000 years?
Ah, okay. That's a helpful way to frame it. Let's take them one by one. What's the first view?
Okay, let's start with view one, or V1. We can call this one separation and sequence. This is probably the neatest approach, chronologically speaking.
Neatest how?
Well, V1 argues that the marriage supper, the feast, it has to conclude entirely. The celebration has to be completely over, the relationship formally established.
And then the kingdom starts.
And only then does the 1,000-year kingdom begin. It's a clean break.
So the celebration marks the end of one phase, maybe the church's preparation, like you said.
Yeah.
And the kingdom marks the start of the next phase, the actual reign itself.
Exactly.
It's very clear, very sequential. Just think. Feast first, then the 1,000-year reign. Okay, that sounds straightforward enough. But what does that separation imply theologically?
Well, V1 implies a pretty clean division between, let's say, reward and administration. The reward, which includes the marriage supper, receiving the bride status. It gets dispensed,
Yeah.
celebrated, finalized in a singular event before any of the practical work of reigning with Christ begins.
Like getting your medal before you start the job.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Proponents of V1 often emphasize this idea that the marriage supper is a necessary step. It establishes the authority of the bride before she begins co-ruling.
Give me an analogy.
Okay, think of it like a royal coronation. The coronation happens, then maybe there's a big celebration or feast right after, and then the king actually sits on the throne and starts governing. The ceremony and feast precede the rule.
Got it. Are there downsides to this view noted in the sources?
Yeah, some of our sources point out a potential downside. It could seem to, maybe, diminish the role or the nature of the kingdom itself. If the big celebration is totally separate and happens beforehand, it might make the millennium seem like merely an administrative period rather than a time infused with the unique spiritual glory of that marital union with Christ. Okay, so that's V1, separation and sequence. What's next? Next, we move to view 2, or V2. This one is concurrency and identity, and you touched on this earlier. This is kind of the maximalist view of the celebration.
Yeah, I said it sounds appealing maybe on an emotional level, a 1,000-year feast.
It is tremendously appealing, you're right.
Yeah.
V2 posits that the 1,000-year kingdom is the marriage supper. They're not sequential events. They are, in essence, identical.
So the two concepts are inseparable.
Exactly. According to V2, the celebration, that deep union between Christ and his bride, it lasts for the entire 1,000 years. The reign is the feast.
And the sources acknowledge the appeal of this.
Oh, absolutely. The sources acknowledge that V2 creates this, well, beautiful image. Christ and his saints in a continuous, uninterrupted state of celebration and fellowship for a whole millennium. It sounds wonderful.
But there's always a but in theology, isn't there?
Usually.
Yeah.
As we sort of flagged earlier, while it sounds beautiful, this view immediately creates some, let's call them logistical and theological nightmares, particularly when you start thinking about status differences among the saints, the timing of resurrection, and the fact that there's still a major judgment after the millennium.
Right, the white throne judgment. We'll definitely need to dive deep into those conflicts maybe in the next section. We will. But for now, the key takeaway for V2 is simply this. It sees the millennium as being fundamentally defined by the ongoing marital relationship. Reign equals feast.
Separate. V2. Identical was the third option.
Finally, we have view 3, or V3. This one is described as an internal event. You could almost think of V3 as a kind of reconciliation attempt between the other two.
How does it try to reconcile them?
Well, V3 suggests that the 1,000-year kingdom begins first. The realm gets established, Christ returns, sets up shop, so to speak, and then immediately after that, a relatively short inaugural marriage supper occurs.
So not the whole 1,000 years, but a shorter feast inside the kingdom period.
Exactly. It's an event that marks the formal union happening right at the beginning of the reign.
So the slogan for V3 would be, reign first, then a brief feast inside.
That captures it pretty well. Reign first, brief feast inside.
But then what happens for the other, say, 999 plus years of the kingdom, if the feast itself is short?
Ah, good question. According to V3 proponents, that brief feast is the inauguration. Think of it as the wedding ceremony itself. Following that ceremony, what continues for the duration of the kingdom is the marriage life. Maybe like a honeymoon phase, but lasting 1,000 years, characterized by that ruling relationship.
Okay, marriage life rather than marriage supper for the long haul.
Precisely. And the sources we're looking at, they seem to lean quite strongly toward this interpretation, V3.
Why is that? Why does V3 seem more plausible based on the texts?
Well, it seems to respect the requirements of both the feast and the reign without creating the problems V1 and V2 run into. It acknowledges the need for an administrative kingdom to actually exist before the full marital reward is expressed or celebrated formally.
Right, you need the kingdom set up first.
You do, but V3 still maintains that intimate connection between the feast and the reign, because the feast happens right at the start and inaugurates the marriage life of ruling together.
And you mentioned earlier there's a specific context that ties the feast's timing to judgment, which seems to support V3.
Yes, absolutely. This is a really compelling point for V3 in the sources. If you look at Revelation 19, verse 11 onwards, it describes Jesus returning, but he's not returning quietly, he's returning as the warrior king.
coming to judge his enemies.
Exactly.
Judging his enemies, defeating the forces of the beast, the army is gathered against him, and the sources make a critical assertion based on the flow of Revelation 19.
Yeah.
They say the marriage supper begins after Jesus judges his enemies.
No.
Okay, so judgment comes first.
Judgment comes first. And since this judgment immediately precedes the establishment of the 1,000-year reign in Revelation 20, the timing gets locked in.
How so?
Well, the administrative function, the judgment, the defeat of evil, securing the realm that has to happen first.
Yeah.
Therefore, the feast can't entirely precede the reign, which contradicts V1,
Yeah.
and it can't be the entire reign because of the problems we'll get into, which challenges V2. So the most logical place is for the feast to be initiated right at the start of the reign, maybe immediately following that initial judgment and establishment. That strongly supports V3. So just to summarize V3's flow, the king comes back, cleans house, establishes the kingdom, and then the wedding reception starts, kicking off the 1,000 years of ruling together. That's a good way to put it. It seems to balance the need for divine justice and kingdom establishment with the subsequent divine celebration and reward.
Okay, that sets the stage really well. Now, you mentioned V2, the idea of a continuous 1,000-year feast, has some serious theological problems. Let's dive into those. Why do the sources find that view so problematic? All right, let's tackle the core problem the sources raise with view 2, the idea that the entire 1,000 years is the marriage supper. You said it boils down to distinctions among the redeemed and the timing of judgment and resurrection.
That's exactly right. And the absolute cornerstone of the argument against V2 is this distinction that our sources draw between the bride, a specific status, and what they term general saints.
Okay, bride versus general saints. That sounds like a hierarchy. It does imply a difference in role or reward, at least for a time. Now think about it. If participating in the marriage supper is the prerequisite, the necessary event for attaining that high status of being the bride, then the timing of that supper becomes absolutely critical.
Paramount. And this is where we have to look closely at the white throne judgment. That's the final judgment described in Revelation chapter 20, verse 11.
And the timing of that is clear.
Crystal clear in the text. The white throne judgment occurs unequivocally after the 1,000-year kingdom has ended. The millennium is over, then comes this final judgment.
Okay, and this is the moment, if I remember correctly, when all the dead who weren't part of that first resurrection before the millennium, they're brought forth.
Precisely. They stand before the throne, they're judged according to their deeds, and then they enter the eternal state, assuming their names are in the book of life.
Right. So what's the problem for V2 here?
The sources point out a really critical detail in the scriptural description of the white throne judgment. Even at this extremely late stage, after the millennium is over, the text indicates there is still a resurrection of life happening.
People are still entering eternal life then?
Yes, it seems so. People are still being granted eternal life at the white throne judgment. Now, connect that back to V2.
Okay. If V2 is true, meaning the entire 1,000 years was the marriage supper, and that supper was the defining event to become the bride,
then what about those people resurrected after the 1,000 years are over at the white throne?
They missed it. They missed the supper, the defining event, so they could never become the bride.
That's the conflict V2 creates. It means V2 forces you into a situation where a fundamental status difference, bride versus non-bride, or general saint, must persist beyond the 1,000 years. It has to continue right up to the final judgment and presumably into the eternal state that follows.
So under V2, the bride would have received the 1,000-year kingdom as their specific reward tied to that supper.
Right. It's a distinct high-level reward status. And if V2 were true, those resurrected later, even if they receive eternal life, would seem to be forever relegated to a lower non-bride status. They'd be in the eternal kingdom, but not part of that elite group defined by the millennial marriage supper.
That feels uncomfortable. Does that align with the overall trajectory of God's plan as described elsewhere? Why would that status difference need to end after the millennium, according to the sources?
This is where we get into a really profound theological transition that the sources highlight. It's about the ultimate goal after the millennium. They talk about the Father becoming the all-in-all.
Okay, the Father becomes all in all. Where's that come from?
It's referencing passages like 1 Corinthians 15, particularly verse 28. The sources argue quite strongly, based on texts like these, that the 1,000-year kingdom serves a specific, necessary, but intermediate purpose.
Intermediate, meaning it's not the final state.
Exactly. It's the stage where Christ reigns supreme as king, putting all enemies definitively under his feet. completing his mission, you could say. But once that task is fully accomplished, the sources suggest he then hands the perfected kingdom back to the Father.
So the specific role of the Son as the administrative ruling groom figure during the millennium, that eventually gives way to something else.
It seems so. It gives way to the ultimate unifying reality of God the Father being all in all. This phrase implies a perfect, encompassing, and completely unified state of being for all the redeemed.
A state beyond the structures of the millennium.
Yes. And in that ultimate state, the thinking goes, the distinct administrative and relational structure of groom and bride, which existed specifically to facilitate Christ's intermediary reign and dispense, his rewards is expected to dissolve. Its purpose will have been fulfilled.
And if that specific relational structure ceases to exist,
Then the status differences tied to it, like bride versus general saint, must also cease to exist. If they didn't, you'd have a hierarchy carrying over into that final perfect unity, which seems contradictory.
okay, that is a powerful argument against V2. Because if the bride status, defined by the 1,000-year supper, persists right up to the white throne, then that status difference bleeds into the eternal state, potentially compromising that post-millennial unity when the Father is all in all.
Precisely. The internal logic presented in the sources dictates that the administrative reward, the bride status, and its associated role must be fulfilled during the kingdom period. It needs to conclude, allowing for that necessary, perfect transition to the Father being all in all afterward.
Therefore,
Therefore, the 1,000-year kingdom cannot be the full marriage supper period. It just doesn't work with the endgame theology. The marriage supper must either conclude entirely beforehand, which is V1,
or, more likely based on the judgment timing,
or happen early within the kingdom, which is V3. This ensures the bride's status is established, the reward is dispensed early on, and the role is fulfilled within the confines of the millennium itself.
and V3 fits this particularly well, doesn't it? Because the status of being the bride, the governing elite, the king priests, is what defines their role for the entire millennial reign, even if the supper part itself was just a brief inaugural event.
Exactly. The V3 model allows the status and the role of the bride to last 1,000 years, fulfilling the reward aspect, while the event of the supper is short, respecting the timing constraints and avoiding the post-millennial status problem.
Okay, so it's not about denying the celebration is important, but about defining its nature. Is it the entirety of the reward, or the inauguration of the reward, and its duration relative to that final unifying work of the Father?
That's a great way to summarize the issue.
All right, this leads us directly to the next big question. If this bride status is such a distinct, administrative, and seemingly temporary reward, existing mainly during the 1,000 years, who exactly receives it? Let's define the bride. So, if the bride status isn't for everyone redeemed, and it's a distinct reward specific to the 1,000 years, we need to know the criteria. Who qualifies for this, well, spiritual elite status? Who is the bride, according to the source material we're examining?
The sources are remarkably specific on this point. They move beyond just a general notion of the church being the bride in this context.
Okay.
In the context of the millennial kingdom and the marriage supper reward, the bride is identified very specifically as the martyr witnesses.
The martyrs, those who died for their faith.
Yes. This specific high-status role of bride, associated with ruling in the kingdom, is presented as being reserved for those who demonstrated the ultimate faithfulness, laying down their lives for the testimony of Christ.
That's a very stringent requirement.
It is. And it connects directly to the concept of the first resurrection mentioned in Revelation chapter 20, verse 4. Those who are beheaded for their witness to Jesus and for the word of God, who hadn't worshipped the beast, they lived and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. The sources equate this group with the bride receiving the millennial reward.
Wow. Okay, so it elevates those who paid the ultimate price to a specific ruling class within the kingdom. But I have to ask, what about the vast numbers of other faithful saints? Those who lived righteously, loved God, served him faithfully, but weren't martyred? Especially those resurrected before the millennium begins. Where do they fit in?
That's a really necessary clarification, and the sources do address it, implicitly at least. The martyr witnesses receive the specific designation of the bride, which comes with the reward of ruling authority. The other faithful saints, who are also resurrected, glorious, and redeemed at the beginning of the millennium, they would likely be considered the general saints we mentioned earlier. Or perhaps the invited guests to the wedding supper. They are blessed, they are part of the kingdom, they are redeemed and glorious, but they don't seem to hold that specific administrative king-priest authority that is given uniquely to the bride, the martyr witnesses.
So the picture of the 1,000 years is definitely a structured kingdom. It's governed, and the bride status reflects the highest office within that government, co-reigning with Christ.
Exactly. And this status, being the bride, is explicitly defined in the sources as a reward that lasts precisely for the 1,000 years.
Is there scriptural backup cited for this reward concept?
Yes, the sources draw a direct line to the parable in Luke chapter 19, verses 11 through 27. Remember the parable of the minas, or pounds? The faithful servants who invested well were rewarded by the returning nobleman.
Right, one was given authority over 10 cities, another over 5 cities. Exactly. Based on their stewardship. The sources see this as a direct parallel. The reward for the bride, the martyr witnesses, is tangible and administrative. Authority, rulership, co-reigning with Christ over the millennial earth. The 1,000-year reign is the time when the groom, the son, Christ reigns, and the martyr witnesses, the bride, co-reign with him. And this unique ruling relationship also seems to confirm the exclusive nature of their connection during that time. It certainly does. The sources emphasize this point. During this specific 1,000-year period, the son is the groom, and the martyr witnesses are the bride. And crucially, the bride does not marry anyone else, meaning
Their primary spiritual and administrative relationship is solely with the groom, the son. That unique relationship defines their role as co-regents with him. It's a designation tied to their function within the millennial kingdom.
Okay. And you keep stressing, and the sources stress, that this is temporary. Let's reinforce that point again. Why must this specific bride status, this reward, end after the 1,000 years?
Well, it ties right back to what we discussed about the Father becoming all in all. It's about the fulfillment of purpose. Once the 1,000 years are concluded, the specific task of establishing Christ's reign and subduing enemies is complete. The reward associated with that task has been fully dispensed and experienced.
And then comes the transition.
Then comes the transition where Christ delivers the kingdom to the Father. At that point, the sources suggest, the reason for the distinct bridegroom administrative structure ceases to exist. And therefore, the expectation is that after this unique administrative phase, a grand state of equality will prevail among all the redeemed in the final eternal state.
So the distinction between the king priest, the bride, and the general saint just vanishes.
It vanishes into the perfect unity of the eternal state under the Father. The source material suggests this quite strongly. If that distinction, that hierarchy based on the millennial reward, were to last forever, it would imply a fundamental difference persisting throughout all eternity, which seems hard to reconcile with the ultimate unity described in passages like 1 Corinthians 15.
That makes sense. Now, there's another crucial connection the sources make regarding the bride's identity and role. It has to do with a specific location.
Yes, the New Jerusalem. This connection is presented as absolutely vital.
How are the bride and the New Jerusalem linked?
The sources essentially equate the bride with those who have the right to enter or perhaps constitute the New Jerusalem. This city, descending from heaven, is portrayed not just as a physical place, but as the symbolic representation of the ruling body, the capital of the millennium, the very seat of authority.
And who gets to enter this city?
The sources maintain that only the king priests enter the New Jerusalem. Remember, the martyr witnesses reign as priests and kings. So entrance into this symbolic city is tied directly to their reward status.
And isn't the New Jerusalem itself given a title in Revelation?
It is. Revelation 21 explicitly calls the descending city the New Jerusalem, the bride, the Lamb's wife.
Wow. So the sources put that together very directly. Very directly. They state it plainly. The New Jerusalem is the wife of the Lamb. This means the bride, identified as the martyr witnesses, king priests, and the city are inextricably linked. They're essentially one and the same concept in this context. The city represents the collective ruling authority, the bride, who co-reigns with Christ from that center. So receiving the bride status is receiving the right to be part of the New Jerusalem.
Exactly. The entrance into this city, being part of it, embodying it, that is the ultimate expression of the reward, the status, and the location of the bride, all rolled into one glorious package for the millennium.
This really does add immense weight to the idea that the marriage supper must be the inauguration of this rulership, right? It's like you're invited to the installation ceremony of these king priests who constitute the New Jerusalem.
Precisely. It solidifies V3 reign begins, city descends, brief inaugural feast, then 1,000 years of ruling as the bride city, as the most coherent view presented in these sources, tying together identity, reward, location, and timing.
Okay. We've built a strong case. based on the sources, against V2 and for V3. But let's be thorough. Are there textual arguments that still seem to pull towards the idea that the kingdom and the marriage event must be closely linked, even if not identical, like V2 suggests? Arguments that reinforce V3's timing?
Yes, absolutely. Even though we've challenged V2 quite strongly, there are definitely elements in the text highlighted by the sources that demand a very strong immediate linkage between the start of the kingdom and the marital event. These actually bolster the case for V3, the brief feast happening right at the start, followed by the marriage life within the reign.
Okay, what are these textual timing constraints?
Well, one major prerequisite that the sources point to for the wedding celebration, the supper, is the destruction of the great evil systems on earth. Specifically, Revelation says the wedding promise, the announcement the marriage of the Lamb has come, happens after the destruction of the harlot Babylon.
Babylon representing those vast, corrupt, worldly systems, political, economic, religious.
Exactly, that great opponent of God's people and purposes. She must be judged and destroyed first. That seems clear in the text.
And that destruction, that judgment, that sounds like a core part of establishing the kingdom, right? Part of the king returning and cleaning house, as we said.
It absolutely is. The sources interpret the fall of Babylon as an immediate prerequisite for the marriage supper. The chaos, the rebellion, the great harlot system has to end before the divine celebration can properly begin.
Okay, but how does this timing detail specifically support V3 over, say, V1?
Well, think about the wording. The text says, essentially, Babylon is judged. Now the marriage of the Lamb has come, and his wife has made herself ready. It implies a very tight sequence. The promise, the readiness has arrived, but it doesn't explicitly say the feast has begun or ended right at that moment.
Ah, okay, so the announcement comes right after the judgment.
Right. And this timing really challenges V1, which suggests the feast ends before the 1,000-year kingdom begins. But the sources argue the kingdom has to be established first, or at least concurrently with the judgment of Babylon, because that judgment is part of the initiation of the reign.
You need the king on the throne, the enemy defeated, the realm secured.
Exactly. The kingdom must be set up securely before the celebration of the union and the start of that administrative marriage life can really commence. If the feast happened entirely before the kingdom was established, V1, where would these newly designated king priests rule? It doesn't quite fit. It makes much more logical sense scripturally for the Lord to return, judge Babylon, establish the kingdom first, and then have the brief inaugural feast to kick off the ruling phase.
That lines up perfectly with V3. What else supports this close link?
There's also the direct connection the sources make between the invitation to the feast and the invitation to the reign.
How so? Remember the blessing, Revelation 19.9. Blessed are those who are invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb. The sources connect this blessing directly to the blessing of being part of the 1,000-year kingdom, particularly those who have part in the first resurrection in Revelation 20.6. Blessed and holy is he who has part in the first resurrection. They shall be priests of God and of Christ and shall reign with him 1,000 years. So being invited to the supper is effectively being invited into that ruling priestly class for the millennium.
That's the implication drawn. Even if the supper itself is a brief event, as in V3, the status granted by being invited and participating is the status of reigning throughout the millennium. The invitation to the feast is the invitation to rule. They are intrinsically linked concepts, even if the sequence respects those administrative necessities we discuss: kingdom first, then feast.
Okay. Now, there's a particularly dense sequence involving Revelation 19 and Revelation 21 that the sources use to really try and nail down the V3 timeline. This involves the establishment of the new heavens and new earth, which seems unexpected.
Yes, this sequence, as interpreted by the sources, is highly detailed and crucial for their V3 conclusion. Let's try to walk through it step by step based on their reading.
All right, where does it start? It starts, as we've said, with the Lord returning and judging his enemies. That's Revelation 19.1 and following. Immediately after this victory, the bride is seen prepared, ready in her fine white linen. Revelation 19.7 to 8. Okay, judgment, then readiness.
Now, here's the crucial and perhaps controversial step in their interpretation. The sources assert that after this initial judgment and the bride's preparation, Jesus establishes the new heavens and new earth, referencing Revelation 21, verse 1, "Now I saw a new heaven and a new earth."
Wait a minute, hold on. My understanding, and I think the common view, is that the new heavens and new earth come after the millennium, after the white throne judgment, when the old order completely passes away. Why do these sources place their establishment here, right at the start of the millennium?
That's a critical question, and you're right, it differs from many common timelines. The sources seem to suggest an interpretation where the new heavens and new earth, or perhaps a significant preparatory manifestation or initiation of them, are established right at the beginning of the 1,000-year kingdom.
Why would that be necessary then?
Yeah.
The reasoning ties directly back to the bride and the New Jerusalem. Their logic is, this renewed creation provides the perfect, purified environment needed for the bride city, the New Jerusalem, to descend from heaven. They point out Revelation 21.2, where John sees the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband.
Okay. So if the New Jerusalem is the bride and it's the capital, the seat of the millennial government, it must descend at the beginning of the millennium to fulfill its ruling function, not at the end.
And it can only descend after the new heavens and new earth are prepared for it. That's the sequence they derive from reading Revelation 21.1, followed by 21.2, in the context of the millennial inauguration. The new creation must be ready before the prepared bride city descends onto it. Wow. Okay, so let's try and piece together the full V3 sequence according to this interpretation. All right, based on the sources, the sequence looks something like this. 1. The Lord returns and judges his enemies. Rev 19.1 FF, victory secured. 2. The bride, martyr witnesses, is seen prepared in fine linen. Rev 19.78, readiness declared. 3. The new heaven and new earth are made, or at least initiated. Rev 21.1, the stage is set. 4. The bride New Jerusalem descends from heaven. Rev 21.2. The ruling body arrives, initiating the king-priest reign. 4. The bride New Jerusalem descends from heaven. Rev 21.5. Then, the brief marriage supper occurs, the formal inauguration of this reign and relationship. 4. The bride New Jerusalem descends from heaven. Rev 21.6. And finally, the 1,000 years of marriage life, the actual co-reigning of Christ and the bride in the New Jerusalem over the renewed earth commences. That structure. It's intricate, but it does seem to respect all those administrative relational requirements we've been talking about simultaneously, doesn't it?
It appears to, yes. It allows the king-priests, the bride, to begin their reign in the appropriate renewed realm, the new heaven, earth, and the descended city. And crucially, it keeps the specific reward status, bride, contained within the millennium, resolving the issue of status differences before that ultimate transition to the Father all-in-all state.
So according to the sources we're examining, this V3 model, with this specific timing including the early new heavens and earth, emerges as the most textually constrained and theologically coherent model.
That seems to be their strong conclusion, but just as we spend all this time meticulously dissecting the sequence, trying to get the clock right down to the second, figuratively speaking, the sources take a significant turn.
A turn how? They move towards the deepest and perhaps most humbling insight they offer, the inherent limitations of our ability as created beings to sequence these kinds of eternal events at all.
So after building this detailed timeline, they remind us how hard it is to build timelines.
Exactly. It's a necessary dose of perspective. Okay, this feels important. We've just been engaged in some pretty intense theological geometry, haven't we? Trying to fit these incredibly complex, multidimensional, spiritual events, judgment, feast, reign, new creation, into a neat linear sequence that our minds can grasp.
We have. Stacking boxes on a timeline.
But you're saying the sources themselves then pivot. They shift to a more philosophical point. But the constraints placed upon us as created beings when we try to deal with God's eternal timeline.
That's right. They essentially ask the question, why is sequencing the 1,000-year kingdom and related events so difficult in the first place? Why are there different views? Why is it so hard to be certain? And the answer isn't just the Bible is hard to interpret. No, it goes deeper than that. The answer presented is rooted in metaphysics and the fundamental nature of our existence versus God's existence. The core idea is this. The creature, the created being, that's us, exists only within time and space. We're bound by these dimensions. We can't step outside of them. We can't. Our consciousness, our perception, our ability to remember a past and anticipate a future, it's all fundamentally linear, embedded within the flow of time and the confines of space.
So, if we are literally confined to time and space, then we can't even really begin to truly imagine what it means to be outside of them, can we?
That's exactly the point the source material emphasizes. The creature cannot fully or accurately imagine the conditions, the realities, the events that exist or occur outside of time and space. It's like a two-dimensional being trying to comprehend a three-dimensional object.
We lack the necessary framework. We do. We can only perceive and interpret what is revealed to us within our framework. What God allows us to understand through revelation, filtered through our time-space limitations. The sources reference passages like John 3.27, a person can receive only what is given them from heaven. And Matthew 10.29, even a sparrow falling is noted by God, to highlight our dependence on divine disclosure. Our prophetic charts, no matter how detailed, are ultimately just, well, flat projections of a much higher dimensional reality. This leads us then, I imagine, to the critical paradox concerning Christ himself, the second person of the Trinity who somehow bridges the gap between the creator and the creature. This is the absolute hinge point, the crux of this entire discussion about perspective. The second person of God, Christ, is described in places like Colossians 1:17 as the one through whom and for whom all things were created, and crucially, the one in whom all things hold together. He sustains reality.
He sustains time and space itself. He is the framework, the underlying constant, the ongoing source of existence for our entire reality. In his divine nature, he is outside of time, upholding it.
But the incarnation. In Jesus, he voluntarily placed himself inside time and space.
Yes. And that's the staggering, mind-bending paradox. The second person of God is simultaneously in his divine nature, outside of and sustaining time and space, and yet through the incarnation, he fully entered into time and space as a creature.
Truly human. Truly human, existing with flesh and bone even after the resurrection, as Luke 24:39 emphasizes. Yet he never stopped being God, equal with God, as John 5:18 asserts, the sustainer of all things. He is somehow the Lord of the dimension while being fully present in the dimension.
Okay, my head hurts a little. But how does this profound paradox impact our attempts to, say, precisely time the marriage supper relative to the millennium?
Well, if God, including the Son in his divine nature, experiences or perceives time in a fundamentally different way than we do, then our very definitions of before and after, start and end, might be, well, relative or perhaps even inadequate from his perspective. Our linear sequence might not map perfectly onto his reality. It's certainly relative. The sources push this further, arguing that for God, even existence and non-existence operate on completely different rules than they do for us. They quote passages like Daniel 4:35, "He does as he pleases, no one can restrain his hand," and Psalm 39:5, "You've made my days a mere handbreadth," to assert that for God, everything is possible to be and also possible to not be, according to his sovereign will. That's hard to grasp. For us, something either exists or it doesn't.
Right, for us, existence feels binary, but the sources suggest that for God, it's more fluid within his ultimate reality and power. They even suggest that what we perceive as non-existent is, in some way, already contained within God's knowledge or potentiality.
If something currently non-existent from our view is already within God, does that mean our linear progression of history, our future, is already like a completed event in his mind? That seems to be the implication. The non-existent is already encompassed by God. This perspective helps understand why the sources suggest God might perceive the created world as, in a sense, always existing from his viewpoint. Think of Jeremiah 1:5. "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you." He knew Jeremiah before Jeremiah existed in time. Exactly. And even more profoundly, remember Jesus' statement in Luke 20:37, quoting God speaking to Moses at the burning bush. He calls God the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. Jesus then concludes, he's not the God of the dead, but of the living, for to him all are alive. So too, to God, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. People long dead from our perspective, they are currently alive in his presence and his reality. Past, present, future coexist for him.
It seems so. He isn't discovering the future as it unfolds for us. He is sustaining all of it, perhaps, in an eternal present tense.
Okay, but if everyone is always alive to God in this sense, how do we reconcile that with scriptural passages where God seems to consider certain elements of the created world, even entire nations, as essentially nothing?
That's the beautiful, necessary tension of the creator-creature dynamic. While God holds all existence simultaneously from his perspective, he also views entities and events relative to his own infinite being and his ultimate purpose. The sources point to Isaiah 40, verse 15.
What does that say?
It says, God considers all the nations, and think about that, the sum total of human power, empires, administrations throughout history. He considers them as a drop in a bucket, regarded as dust on the scales. He brings princes to naught and reduces the rulers of this world to nothing. Later in verse 17, before him all the nations are as nothing. They are regarded by him as worthless and less than nothing.
So, from God's infinite scale, the entirety of human history, the rise and fall of empires, even maybe our meticulously planned 1,000-year kingdom, it registers as utterly insignificant compared to his own eternal reality.
That seems to be the perspective offered. So, when we engage in these detailed debates about the precise timing of a 1,000-year reign, we're arguing over a period that, from one angle, is infinitely crucial as the culmination of Christ's redemptive work and reign.
But from another, metaphysical angle,
From God's eternal perspective, it's perhaps like a fleeting moment, relatively empty compared to his own infinite nature.
That is incredibly humbling, especially after spending so much time trying to nail down the sequence.
It is. And that's the final implication the sources draw for our study of eschatology. Our human attempts to precisely sequence these eternal events, to measure the exact duration of the feast versus the marriage life, to pinpoint when the new heavens and earth really start. They are fundamentally constrained by our existence within this reality of time and space, a reality that the Creator both sustains and transcends.
So we're trying to measure God's wisdom, which Romans 11.33 tells us is unsearchable, his paths beyond tracing out. We're trying to grasp his greatness, which Psalm 145.3 says is beyond our comprehension. We can only see dimly, piece together the clues he's given us. So maybe that complex V3 timeline we constructed, the brief feast, the marriage life within the kingdom, the timing linked to judgment, and the New Jerusalem's descent. Maybe that's simply the closest we can get to charting that higher dimensional reality using our limited, linear, creaturely terms.
That's a very insightful way to put it. It might be the best projection we can make onto our flat map, based on the shadows cast by the eternal realities described in Scripture.
Okay, this has been, well, truly a deep dive. We've gone from specific textual analysis to the very nature of time and existence. Let's try to bring it back and summarize the key takeaways for you, our listener, as you process all this complex source material. #tag outro. All right, that was a journey. We haven't just discussed prophecy today. We've really delved into the metaphysics that underpin how we even think about prophecy in eternal timelines. Let's distill the main points from the sources we explored.
Okay. First, I think the central debate we mapped out is crucial. The sources strongly argue that the 1,000-year kingdom is not the marriage supper itself. That's view 2, and it seems to fail theologically.
Why, again, briefly?
Because it creates that problem of status differences, bride versus general saint, potentially lasting into the final eternal state. The sources insist those role-based distinctions tied to the groom-bride dynamic of the millennium must conclude when the father becomes all in all after the 1,000 years are over. The roles are temporary, administrative, and need to be completed within that time frame.
Okay, so V2 is largely rejected by these sources. Second key takeaway.
Second, we need to be clear about the specific identity and nature of the bride's status, at least within this millennial context. It's not presented as a universal designation for the entire church throughout all time.
Right. According to these sources, it's a specific, temporary, 1,000-year reward.
Exactly. A reward given particularly to the martyr witnesses who become the king priests co-reigning with Christ. This status grants them unique authority and, significantly, entrance into or constitution of the New Jerusalem, which itself is identified as the wife of the Lamb, the seat of millennial government.
Okay. And third, the preferred timing.
And finally, the V3 perspective, where the reign begins, and then there's a brief inaugural marriage supper, followed by a 1,000-year marriage life of ruling this view. This view seems to best respect all the textual sequencing prerequisites laid out in the sources.
Especially the need for judgment and the destruction of Babylon before the celebration, and the need for the kingdom's administrative structure to be in place. And that complex sequence involving the early appearance of the new heavens and earth to receive the descending New Jerusalem.
Precisely. V3 seem to tie all those threads together most coherently, according to the logic presented in the material.
But then, we ended by stepping back, moving beyond the ticking clock of prophetic timelines and into the nature of existence itself. We spent all this time trying to chart the sequence of judgment, feast, reign, white throne, judgment. But what happens when we try, even for a moment, to consider time from God's simultaneous, eternal perspective? And that leads me to the final thought I'd like to leave you with, building directly on that paradox of existence we discussed. Think about this. If the creature, if we, can only exist and, importantly, only be destroyed or cease to exist within the confines of time and space, okay? Then consider the absolute certainty with which prophecy speaks about the end of the wicked. Scripture repeatedly says things like, "The wicked shall be no more. You will look diligently for his place, but it shall not be." Psalm 37.9-10. Their destruction is certain.
Yes. But if God sees all time simultaneously, if he inhabits eternity, then for him, the destruction of the wicked, the end of rebellion, and the full commencement of the eternal kingdom, is that really a future event he's waiting for? Or is it, from his perspective, an already accomplished present reality?
Wow. So the provocative thought is this. What does it truly mean for us as creatures bound by linear time to experience a reward, a feast, a reign, when the eternal state those things lead into is utterly divorced from the sequential progression of time that governs our entire current understanding? We've charted the path as best we can from the map provided. But perhaps we should spend more time pondering the nature of the destination itself beyond the sequence of steps to get there. What does that eternal experience outside our linear time truly feel like? That might be the ultimate mystery of the kingdom.